The first autumn rains in Russia were not made of water, but of a cold black mud that clung to the soles of boots and muffled the sound of marching. The year was 1941, and the deafening roar of the Third Reich's mechanized divisions, which had once seemed like the sound of inevitable destiny, was beginning to sink. It wasn't the tactical front line that was breaking first. It was the invisible connection that linked the frozen soldier in the east to the safe Führer in Berlin. In the east, the cold was not just a weather condition. It was a silent and relentless enemy that robbed the grease from rifles and the morale of men, transforming the Blitzkrieg a calvary of attrition. With each step on the frozen mud, the Wehrmacht generals felt the difference between the map and reality. In their military offices, far from the acrid smell of gunpowder and sweat, the advance chart seemed an insult to the memory of the men who had been left behind, turned into ice statues. The secret behind the Wehrmacht was not the power of its tanks, but the fragile command structure that allowed the fanaticism of a single man to supplant the collective knowledge of decades of military tradition. And that secret was about to unfold. General Guderian, the embodiment of the doctrine. Blitzkrieg, he sat on reports that called for a tactical retreat, for a regrouping before the final blizzard engulfed Army Group Center. But the voice emanating from Wolf's Lair, the Führer's headquarters, was that of a messianic prophet, not a pragmatic commander. The order was always the same, not to yield an inch. This was not a military order, it was a psychological statement, a demand for blind faith, transforming strategy into a test of devotion. Prussian discipline, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had taught its men not to question, but to obey. Now, that very obedience was crushing them under the weight of impossibility. The Russian winter was not the only adversary halting the German tanks. It was the paralysis of the leadership, the fear of a general to suggest what was obviously necessary, a strategic retreat, for fear of the wrath that would follow. The tactical battle for the Soviet Union had become a psychological battle for the soul of the German High Command. Who would dare speak the truth to those in power? What unfolded next was not a single battle, but a series of invisible decapitations. The Führer began methodically removing the generals who championed realism. Von Brauchitsch, Halder, Bock, Lieb, the old guard, the masters of the movement, were discarded like useless chess pieces, replaced by men more inclined to obey fantasies than suits. This was the point of no return, the moment when Wehrmacht ceased to be a professional military force governed by principles of war and became a tool of ideological will. The irony was cruel. German military efficiency depended on the decentralization of decision-making, allowing commanders on the battlefield to react quickly. But by taking direct command, the Führer forced the centralization of all tactical decisions thousands of kilometers away, based on static maps and megalomania. The pace slowed. Time, the cruelest enemy, was being wasted. This secret, that of a military command corroded by fear and ideology, was not merely a strategic problem, it was an emotional cost. The men fighting on the Eastern Front knew that intelligence and common sense were no longer in command. They fought under the cloak of silent betrayal. Colonel General Hübner, an Iron Man of the cavalry who dared to retreat his troops to protect their lives during the 1941 crisis, was dismissed, stripped of his honor, his uniform, and his pension. The act was more than a punishment. It was a message to everyone else. From that moment on, the General Staff understood that personal security and professional survival depended on subservience, not competence. The war machine, once terrifying in its cold efficiency, began to move based not on calculations of logistics or firepower, but on the fear of reprisal. Fear rose through the ranks faster than any panzer unit ever had. The air in the German bunkers grew colder, thinner, stifling any voice of reason. With each setback at Stalingrad, Kursk, or later Normandy, the vicious cycle repeated itself. The greater the danger, the more frantically the Führer clung to his absolute authority, removing anyone who brought bad news. When the Sixth Army was besieged at Stalingrad, Paulus, the commander, knew that the only chance of survival